Special welcome to the audience who are still coming in. Particularly because it's a pretty diverse group. It includes or comprises of economists, political scientists, business school researchers, academics, students, Laurier from Laurier, University of Waterloo, and CG, which is the Corporate Governance Institute here in Waterloo. In addition, we have many technology professionals from the area, entrepreneurs, and members of the community at large. Today's agenda is as follows. My esteemed colleague, Benson Honig, who is a professor of management here at Laurier, will introduce the speaker. Following that, Dr. Swamy will deliver his lecture. We have allotted 30 minutes approximately for question and answers from the audience. Finally, my colleague Tracy Snodden, who is a professor of economics here, will propose a word of thanks and also present a little commentary. I now turn over the floor to Benson. Thank you.
Joe Stiglitz, an economist, Cortez, a sociologist. None of us can escape it, but that's all discussion, the debate that's happened in the last decade. But if we look back further, there have been some kind of scholars that have looked at globalization before it was really a prominent force, when it was even perhaps not popular in certain environments to discuss it. And it's always a pleasure to introduce a visionary, someone who takes academic work and does more than just simply write the articles, but also has an impact in social force and social action, and then continues publishing and doing research. The scholar, Dr. Swamy, he actually did his thesis with two Nobel laureates, Simon Kuznets and Paul Samuelson, right? So we've all read Samuelson's book, right? Which suggests that if you want a Nobel Prize, give them a PhD, right? That's the secret to success.
As an introduction pointed out, is a matter of great international interest. The Time magazine, in its European Asian edition, is running a 7-article series on the subject of India and China. And the first 2 articles have been on India, and it's stated the idea that India is a poor country is a relatively recent one. The article goes on to emphasize that, and I quote, in hindsight, what is happening today with the rise of India and China is not some miraculous novelty, so much as a return to the traditional pattern of global trade in the medieval ancient world. So indeed, there has been a sea change of transformation in outlook from regarding India and China, and India till very recently, as a country of disease, poverty, beggars, etc., to a country which is returning to its position of great preeminence economically in the global world. In fact, by then pre-modern economic standards, India and China were the 2 most developed countries up to about 1790. And it's really after the Industrial Revolution and imperialism that the decline started for the 2 countries. Complained that the ships have to come empty and then buy the goods and take them back. Could the king not consider buying something from the United States of America? And the king said, well, there's everything available here. What do I want to buy from your country? So they said, you can think of something, please do, because we don't want the ships to come empty. And finally he said, well, I live in South India, I've never seen ice. It's up in the north, I have to go all the way to the Himalayas to see it. So I hear that in your country ice is easily available, and particularly winter. So I'd like you to bring me ice. So when the winter the pond froze, they cut it up into ice blocks, put sawdust on it, and took it all the way to India to sell it. And that was the state of inequality in the industrial have performances of India and China with the West. That was transformed, and between the periods of 1870 and 1950, the decline in the two countries was very sharp and steep. And by 1950, both countries have become the world's poorest countries from being the world's richest countries. Now, after independence, and before I talk about recent progress, I'd like to just give you a little background because it's important to see the context in which what is happening today is remarkable. After independence in India and liberation in China, between the years 1950 to 1980, those 30 years, India and China recovered because between 1870 and 1950, the best estimates for growth rates in the two countries is GDP growth rate of 0.5% per year. And he was also not in favor, but then they died prematurely, or untimely, I would say. And the net result is that Nehru got complete unquestioned power, was by inclination a socialist, and he adopted the Soviet economic model. The Soviet economic model called for extraction of resources from agriculture to finance industrial development. And the Indian agriculture had already been bled during the British period through the revenue-collecting machinery of the zamindari system. And it was in dire need of new investment. And there was no scope for its resources being made available by agriculture for financing industrial development. And as a consequence, we had a major food problem. And ultimately, over the years, the Soviet model became unpopular. And finally, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet model lost its patron. And as a consequence, in a situation of crisis in 1991, we adopted economic reforms. I'm happy to say I was part of that team which drew up the economic reform package, although the credit naturally would go to the then Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, and his Finance Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who is now the Prime Minister. And these kinds of data corrections are necessary. And the Chinese authorities put so much pressure on the provincial levels to produce statistics quickly that I'm sometimes suspicious whether the data you get which are passed off as constant price estimates are really current price estimates. And I would say that any estimates of China that you have, that you get on growth rates, for example, growth rates of GDP, you should perhaps knock off 1.5% to 2% of that to get the correct answer. If they say they're growing at 11%, they are growing at 9%. 9 is also very substantial. Because I won't go so far as Professor Tom Brofsky, I don't know whether he's from Toronto or from Montreal. He was at Harvard, so I knew him when he was a student. He went so far as to say that the Chinese actually cook the books. I don't quite agree that they cook the books. It's very difficult to cook the books. Then you'll have to have two sets of books, one for the politician and one for the general public. And then once you start cooking up, then you have to go on increasing cooking, and it soon will explode. So I don't agree with that view. But I would say that indeed we have, when we compare India and China, India has been at a great disadvantage because it's an open society and everything about India gets published, whereas China is still continues to be a controlled society, and therefore it's what is really happening. You learn very late. I think this is one very important thing that's developing because both China and India have a problem of agricultural labor surplus. And China has to move perhaps another 200 million people out of agriculture in order to make the agriculture more sustainable. India also could do with moving its extra labor in agriculture to industry. Services are not that employment intensive. So how that is done in the few coming years is something that's going to be very important. So I would say this is one. The second thing you have to notice about the recent progress between India and China, the Chinese have essentially supplied the demand, or provided the demand for the supply in boom in labor-intensive manufacturers by exports. They have exported to the West in large amounts. And what is interesting about these exports is, about the Chinese foreign trade, is that when you look a little below the surface, you find two things coming out very clearly. One is that Chinese exports are perhaps 65% reprocessed products. That is, products which were originally being produced in East Asia, going directly to Europe and to North America, are now going through China, getting reprocessed, and then a little value addition, and then getting exported to the West. In other words, if you were to add the trade from China to the West and the trade of East Asia to the West, that as a ratio of GDP hasn't changed at all. In other words, China has a deficit in trade with East Asia. It has a surplus in trade with West. And that surplus is more than the deficit, and that's how they produce their trade surplus. So I asked my Foreign Secretary whether we could organize that. He said it's impossible because the total production of Indian software is only $100 million. How are you going to provide $1 billion to the Samsung Corporation? That was the position. It all changed. Today, India is going to be an $80 billion IT industry, and the impetus was given by the Y2K. So India is basically a software-dominated IT market, whereas the Chinese are a hardware-dominated market. Their software is a small part of their IT industry, and it's mostly used within India, within their country. And it is lower order, blue-collar level software. India has software, but 70% of it is exported. Indian industry barely uses it. In fact, if textile industries were to use for quality control the IT, it would become a challenger to China. Today, China is unchallenged in the textile world, thanks to the WTO. But India has not been a match except for the garment area because of this particular fact. So I think we must know that the IT between the two countries cannot be compared. Although China is making heroic efforts to see that the software improves, but they have an essential problem. Perhaps we have one of the unintended consequences of British rule in India is that most of us speak English fluently, and that has given us great access to Western markets. And for China, that's a disadvantage. I'm not arguing that the British deliberately, in order to enable us to have an IT revolution, made us learn English. It was an unintended consequence. Collected from the suburbs of Bombay, and they are put on trains, brought and then separated and delivered in the offices so that your home food arrives for you to eat, and then the empty lunch boxes are collected back and delivered back with a 0.001 error. It's an amazing, organizational, innovative enterprise, which has now started receiving international attention. So much so that the Prince of England, Prince Charles, was so taken up that in his wedding he had the managers of this enterprise come specially to England to be guests of honor at his wedding. Here is something to be seen. This is this aspect of innovation, which is backed by India's democracy, because it's impossible to have innovation without free thinking, and free thinking requires democracy. That's another great advantage India has over China. And so I would say this is another. The agriculture is one area. The change in direction of the exports, reprocessing exports towards India is another area. And the third area is innovation, where India has already shown in design work how much progress it can make. Today, the entire chip from the Texas Instruments comes out of Bangalore. Of course, Bangalore has now become all kinds of things. The other day I saw a taxi with a big billboard saying, Jesus wants you, call him at so-and-so telephone number. So I dialed the number to find out whether in fact I could reach Jesus. And the pious man came and he said, what troubles you, my boy, and all that. And but I felt that that accent had some ring, although it was very Americanized accent. I felt that there's something Indian about it. So I asked him, where are you calling from? And he said, from Bangalore. So even Bible recitations is now being outsourced. So finally, I'll say the most crucial thing that that exists in the recent progress between India and China is the financial system. Let us history is strewn with examples of countries which progressed very fast and then had a blowout and never recovered. Latin America is an example. Yeah. There was a time when people thought Argentina would overtake the United States. And then again in 1950s and 60s they thought Argentina, Chile, Brazil, these are the countries which are the next candidates for being the developed countries of the world. They have had a blowout in 81 and they have not recovered. Then you had East Asia. East Asia was in fact touted by the World Bank as the model. And in fact the World Bank brought out a volume called The East Asian Miracle, in which they said all developing countries must learn that East Asia has got its basics right. That is why they are making progress. You also must imitate those basics. And in 1997, 2 years after the book came out, there was a blowout, because the World Bank has since written a companion volume called East Asian Miracle Reconsidered. And Mr. Stiglitz came here, you ought to have asked him, because he's the author of the first book and the second. And they explained that this was not right, that was not right. But the key thing is that if you look at why some countries have progressed and stayed developed countries, why some countries have grown and then had a blowout and then not been able to recover, including Japan. Japan in 1979 was portrayed as a country which would be number one in 10 or 20 years from 20 years hence. But in 1999, it was a basket case almost, and it still is in a lot of problems. Japan went up so fast, they bought up buildings in the United States, they bought up Rockefeller Center. People thought that the United States will be bought by Japan, but it didn't happen that way. We have to understand what the reasons are, and Professor Richard Silla was also when I was a young assistant professor, was a student in my class, but I knew him as a personal friend. He's professor at the New York University at the Stern School. He has written his presidential address to the American Economic History Association says that invariably the key distinguishing feature between countries which make progress and remain progressing and those which progress very quickly and then have a blowout is the financial system. If you condition, then you will not have this problem. Both India and China have financial problems, and these problems need solutions. And you have to see whether those solutions will be forthcoming or not. Otherwise, both countries are candidates for a blowout the same way Latin America was, the same way East Asia was. And what is that problem? First of all, in the case of India, all the government budgets, central and state, are essentially bankrupt. They are being sustained by unorthodox means. The Indian central government budget today is financed by loans impounded by the government from state-owned public sector banks, which account for 85% of the deposits even today. Even today, the banks have not been denationalized or privatized. And the government is holding on firm. And about 50% of the funds which are due, if the Chinese were to compromise on growth in order to produce these other changes, and certainly they will have to cut on fixed assets investment, they will have to prune the loans being given by banks to the state-owned enterprises. These major changes would slow the growth rate, and that would be unacceptable to China. Or alternatively, China could free its private sector and say, you get money from abroad, you get money from the banks, and you give us an efficient economy. But that means an independent source of power in China. On that issue, the China Communist Party is very clear. No independent source of power other than one single source, and that's the Communist Party. And therefore, if there's a compromise to be made, give up reforms and keep your party, or weaken your party and have more reforms, I think the Chinese communists are very clear that they will prefer what preserves their party. And that's why nowadays they're talking about harmonious society and in acceptance of authority and things like that, in the confusion. And success of implementing the family planning policies in China. China's proportion of young working force will start declining from 2050. India has no prospect of that decline taking place till 2050. This has deep implications for the financial system, because pension system, for example, is based on new people contributing and that being used to provide social security and pension to those who are retiring. And if the number of people retiring turns out to be larger than the number of people entering the labor force, actually you're going to have a pension bomb, which Europe is facing. But India requires to educate these people, and a major educational transformation is necessary. I would say that Canada's role is really in this number one area, and that is in the education. Thanks to the diaspora here, there's been a major change in Canadian attitudes after a fair amount of roller coaster ride in our relations. Began as both thinking that we have similar backgrounds, Commonwealth backgrounds, they are middle-sized powers, and we play a role, but unfortunately the nuclear test, 1974, first soured the relations, and then again in 1998. Of course, you also had some activist foreign minister whose idiom exacerbated relations quite a lot. But today, I would say that there are a number of areas where India is looking to Canada to help build. One is India's financial sector in modernizing this financial services. Second is in the mining sector, where China, the democracy and demography and the sheer stability provided by our diversity is our strong point. Whereas for China, the inability to have devolution of political power is the one that would be the major stumbling block. This is what I want to say. Thank you very much.
Dr. Swamy, my name is Amar Badami. I am in the financial business in Canada, and I follow politics and economics of India pretty closely. One of the issues that you brought up was that Narasimha Rao, Chandrababu Naidu, and S.M. Krishna didn't get re-elected. And don't you think that is because they didn't address the issues in rural India? And you talk about the suicide rates that are going up. What is the government of India planning to do about this? How are they going to address that?
Well, first of all, I'll take your second question first and then the other one next. There's nothing anybody can do unless the price that the farmer receives is much higher than what they're getting today. And that is not possible because the higher price would mean inflation, and inflation will mean defeat in elections. So every government is trying to do this by giving out doles, by subsidies, etc. These are not workable propositions because they do not reach the farm. The only way to rescue Indian agriculture is by globalizing it, by enabling the farmer to export. And that is the key way in which agriculture can be moved, and that would require, first of all, giving up your land reform legislation, which doesn't allow land consolidation, giving up all the market restrictions of travel for farm products, and to have a modern infrastructure that enables you to package, store, house, cold storage, and to be able to provide the market intelligence through internet to the farmer to be able to sell abroad. That's the only way Indian agriculture can be rescued. Otherwise, you definitely going to have a revolt on your hands. Second question, what is the reason for the defeat? Well, I think they were defeated in urban areas also. In the city of Hyderabad, where the maximum changes take place, the Telugu Desam got the worst defeat possible. The city of Bangalore went wholesale to the BJP in the last election. So I don't think that it's got to do with the fact that they didn't address rural problems. It has got to do with the fact that those vested interests who felt threatened were able to have the money and the infrastructure to campaign and mobilize against these leaders.
Swamy, I'm Barbara Wilson-Roberts. I'm faculty member here in the Geography Department. My interests are in immigration and development links. And I'm interested, you didn't mention a comparison between India and China with regards to things like remittances. I wonder if you would mind perhaps.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that the share of non-resident Chinese to Chinese investment fund is a high proportion, increasing proportion. In the case of India, it is a declining proportion, although it's not a small proportion. The remittances did help us, particularly the remittances from the West Asia or Middle East, did help India in the 80s, late 70s, to tide over the foreign exchange shortage. But we also know that 1990, part of the financial crisis we had was the panic in the overseas Indian community about the ability of the Indian government to not declare bankruptcy. And they did pull out suddenly $2 billion out of the country. And so remittances are important, but I don't think they can be a real substitute. The difference between India and China is that Chinese diaspora is market savvy, and they are all around the rim. They are in Taiwan, they are in Hong Kong, they are in Singapore, they are in Indonesia in business, they are in Malaysia in business, and Philippines, and they have been very helpful to China in enabling China to export. India's diaspora in the North America is professionals, and they are not that kind of market oriented. Secondly, our diaspora, if I may call it that, after all, Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Pakistan, we are all part of the same country once upon a time. This diaspora is of no use to India because they happen to be poorer than India. There is nothing that Pakistan or Bangladesh can really offer India. So I would say that the Chinese advantage is not in the amount of remittances, while that's not insignificant. It's in the fact that this diaspora is market savvy, and they enable the Chinese to be able to do international trade. And whereas India except in the IT field, and that too because of special reasons. There's other areas that have been helpful, but they haven't made that kind of difference which the Chinese diaspora has made.
I'm a local student of political science at UIU. My question is about rural population and job creation out of agriculture. And if you said that approximately 2 million need to be moved into something else, what about processing zones that are like in China and Latin America? Are these a good viable option?
We move
Well, there's been these zones that have been created. So
Oh, you mean special economic zones?
but are they good for the rural population at all, or just for them?
Well, I think, these special economic zones were really meant for special laws. But if the whole country needs a labor reform, these special economic zones are not going to be able to give you fundamental cutting-edge advantage. In the case of China, of course, because it was a different society altogether. It was a highly controlled society, and the SEZs in Shenzhen provided an island on which people could go. The main problem in India with these special economic zones has been the fact that the government has acquired the land and then given it to the industrialists. What they should have said is to ask the industrialists to directly negotiate with the farmers and the landowners. And that would have meant many of these problems that you are having of peasants going on revolt and of police firing and so on would not have taken place. And I think the government got into this act perhaps probably because some politicians wanted to make money. Otherwise there was no reason for them, the government, to take the responsibility of acquiring the land for the private sector. So I can't see the SEZ making much difference in terms of transferring people. What can make a difference is a fast-growing manufacturing sector. We still need a manufacturing sector which must grow fast, and that's the only way to get additional employment, particularly at the blue-collar level. And we can't rely on cutting-edge industries like IT and pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, which India has a fair amount of development to provide this kind of bulk employment. So I think the focus should be on industry.
One question and another minor comment. The question might be slightly outside the scope of this lecture, but still it's connected.
Yes.
What do you think of this nuclear agreement in the United States? That's the question. The comments, the minor comments, you seem to have assigned great weight for the Y2K thing for the active industry. My own experience is not so much. Just not a question, just
Yeah, I'll respond to that also. But as far as nuclear deal is concerned, I think there is a major trust deficit that exists between India and the United States, which is not being addressed. Are we partners with the United States? Or are we not? A deal of this kind can only be successful if there is a durable partnership between India and the United States. Otherwise, it is subject to interpretation. India is on the verge of a major nuclear revolution in terms of fuel. It will make a breakthrough within the next 4 or 5 years in thorium technology. Fast-metered is the experimentation that is taking place, but ultimately we have 80% of the world's thorium and uranium is depleting. Of course, we have also projects like Canada on hydrogen fuel cells, which I hope succeeds, because that will mean the end of the West Asian aid to terrorism, perhaps. I don't know, but the fact is that in the energy field, if thorium cycle is finally commercialized, then I think India will not need anybody's help to generate enough energy. However, this present deal is based on mutual suspicion. Both are democracies. They talk to the press. A lot of bad feeling is easily created. The fundamental flaw in this agreement, where the trust deficit becomes important, is the requirement that India separate its military reactors from the civilian reactors. But added to it is a clause that if you use any product of the civilian reactors in the future in the military reactors, then that will become equally safeguarded. It's called the pursuit clause. This is something which would mean that either India will have to now build newer civilian facilities for camouflaged, because civilian nuclear reactors henceforth have to come under safeguards under the agreement. Have to build camouflaged nuclear reactors to provide the necessary input into the military reactors, to make the military reactors self-efficient, or face the prospect that over the years that everything of the Indian nuclear industry would come under safeguards. Now, having not signed the non-proliferation treaty, there is no reason why India should now accept the discipline of the non-proliferation treaty as a non-nuclear weapons power. The case of Iran is different. Iran is a signatory to the non-proliferation treaty since 1978. And therefore, if it breaks the law, it is breakage of the law. In India, India has never signed it, faced the sanctions when necessary. And today, all of a sudden, you start accepting de facto the safeguards that were envisaged in the non-proliferation treaty. I think is a question which India has to do some calculation on. Can you trust the Americans not to interpret the statutes, the Hyde Act in particular, in a way that is detrimental to India? It depends on who the president is, depends on who the Indian Prime Minister is. I would think, therefore, India should, if it's going to partner with the United States on anything, should come to a formal conclusion that we and the United States have some common concerns on which we'll work together. And I think there is finding it very difficult. Take, for example, the question of India sending troops to Iraq. It was agreed, and the Deputy Prime Minister of India came to Washington and gave an assurance that yes, troops will be sent, 20,000 will go in the beginning, and then there will be more. And then went back, and Parliament passed a resolution on the day the Saddam statue fell in Baghdad that it is an act of imperialism and condemned the American invasion of Iraq. I mean, it's a total somersault, and it's not something that will inspire confidence. Today, the major partner of the government in power today, the communists, they are saying we are against this treaty because it will increase the proximity of India to the United States. So there's lack of clarity as to how we regard the United States. Osama bin Laden is not under any confusion. He says Israel, India, and the United States, they are three enemies of Islam. Islam anyway. But that's what he has said. The others are, the opponents are clear. But in India, we are still not clear as to what our relationship should be with the United States. And in that, such an agreement, in my opinion, is doomed to failure. Yes,
Or foreign firm is headed by an Indian immigrant entrepreneur. In addition, many of them would go off and establish foreign subsidiaries or new firms in India. If we look over at Canada, we see a much higher percentage of Indians in the population, of a much higher caliber, generally speaking, because we have our point system. And yet, we fail to see that really great burgeoning of Indian entrepreneurship or of transnational entrepreneurship between the two. So my question is there anything that you think Canadians can do or Canada can do at large to facilitate that kind of environment that's so robust in the U.S.?
What? I think your reaction to things which India did was so highly modelistic in the past. And I think you had a foreign minister called Axbury, what do you call him? I mean, his phraseology, I think, irritated Indians to no end. I think probably that has changed since 2002, and what needs to be done is Canada has to have the same kind of open relationship which the United States nurtures in the economic field with India. I see them on many things. I was talking to an Indian diplomat whom I will not name, who was expressing great unhappiness that Canada says that they are with us on terrorism, but they give a free run to the LTTE in Canada, even though it is declared LTTE formally as a terrorist organization, but LTTEs control temples here, they collect funds from the LTTE here, and Canadians are taking a very relaxed attitude. The only Indian interest, a impression definitely is there in India that Canada is highly moralistic with us, and it's very difficult to work with. That background may be that. Second is there has to be some slack available before we can think of another country. The Americans are like a bottomless pit, you see. They are able to suck in talents at great levels. This demographic hole that now has come in Western societies, India is the only country which is going to have surplus of that age group, and the Americans pull that much faster. I think an effort has to be made, and Canada must be seen in the forefront on political issues outside of India, and it's at the moment very understated, and that relationship will not excite collaboration between the two countries.
Relationship China and India. Is there a scenario where they become much more collaborative and look towards kind of common interests? And
by coincidence, Harvard University Fairbanks Center and China's Tsinghua University both asked me to convene an international conference on India, China, United States triangle. And that's the next January. I'm holding it in India. I think this is a very, very important question. And I don't say United States, I would say North America, because there are many aspects, for instance, you're mentioning energy, for example, in terms of certain specialized skills that Canada has, that even Canada and the United States could be taken as one. But I think India has a problem. China is a neighbor, and a neighbor which supports a troublemaker for us from our point of view, namely Pakistan. It's a very strong China-Pakistan relations, much stronger than US-Pakistan relations. And I would say the storming of the masjid, which Musharraf, the mosque that Musharraf did, was entirely because those mullahs went and kidnapped some Chinese beauticians and called them prostitutes and wanted to kill them. And I think the Chinese lead heavily on the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis delivered. The relationship between India and China has to be normal, good, because of this strategic aspect. That if India was to pursue a peaceful economic development, they should have good relations. At the same time, India and the United States have shared democracy in common, they share many other things. There are many things that India wants from the United States, which China can't give to India. And how this is going to work out, I think it's very difficult to say. India and China and competition in Africa, for example. Both countries are investing heavily in African countries and extracting copper and other mineral resources. When it comes to issues, I find Chinese are not very helpful. For example, if India wants a membership to the Security Council on a permanent basis, the Chinese have never come out openly in support. I don't know how they're going to react to the Indo-US nuclear deal if it goes through. The problem there, and there's a problem in India too, the Indian Parliament, which in the next 2 weeks we'll know. So there are many areas of conflict, but we also have a history of maybe 2,500 years, where except once in 1962, we did not have a conflict. On the other hand, people came to India from China, India from India, people went to China. The great karate, which originally came from China, Shaolin as Wushu, was actually by an Indian monk called Bodhidharma, who went from Tamil Nadu to China. There were Chinese monks who came to India. We have had interactions. It's not, and it's been always very friendly. There is a speech given by the president of Beijing University, Dr. Bush, in 1936, when he was invited to speak at Harvard's tricentennial anniversary. And Harvard has reproduced it as part of the tricentennial speeches. And the title of his speech is The Indianization of China. And he speaks about why China is backward. They said because India sent University in this January. I was told by very important politicians that in order now for this jealousy factor to be minimized due to economic growth, they will have to bring back this otherworldly thinking. So in the name of harmonious society, they said we may have to bring Buddhism back. And the first Buddhist conference since 1949 has just recently been held in Hangzhou in China. And there is definitely culturally, even if we look different, Indians and Chinese speak in their family system, their evocatives, their gestures. We feel very comfortable with them. But there's also this other side. I don't know how it works out. Maybe after the conference, if I come by here.
Banks, particularly Citibank, JP Morgan, Investment Bank, American Express, they were out there in India for a long time doing very brisk business, retail especially. The Canadian banks have not done so. They're really promising ones here. We have a great pension funds here. Are we kind of lost in the race, or can we do anything here?
No, I think this is the area, it's financial services area. I think Canadians, I have heard many people in India say that rather than the American who are overextended, we should, get the Canadians to come and their recognized expertise of the Canadians in financial services. Now, I think this is the right moment to go, and that things are opening up also in India, the financial sector.
And I'm just wondering how China and India deal with that.
Well, in my course, I have one lecture devoted to governance, in which I talk about corruption in both countries. Certainly, Transparency International's index, India and China were down the list. Of course, we may be ahead of Bangladesh, I don't know, or Burma or Nepal, but certainly we are far down the list with very corrupt countries. How does one solve problems of corruption in developing societies like India and China? Well, first of all, there have been areas in India where there was terrible corruption, and today there is no corruption. Those stories are not being circulated. For example, in up to 1991, the most harassing corruption that people used to mention on a daily basis was in railway reservations. People couldn't get a reserved ticket on the train without paying a bribe to the ticket counter, or when you get on the train without a confirmed reservation and the conductor is there, you bribe him. And it was a stinking amount of corruption. Then computerization came. And today there is no corruption, because computerization, you can't change the waiting list, and everything is published, printed, you can access it on your mobile, and so on. So today we have no corruption in railway reservation, which is something which could never have been imagined. So one way of removing corruption is to get this the information technology techniques to be brought in. And we find that now with government forms also, a lot of government forms can be downloaded, and so there is corruption starting to be high. Where the corruption is still very high is in the area of political politicians accepting bribes for an inferior decision because the inferior product which they wanted to sell or have a contract on could not meet the competitive standards. So you got some reason and give it to somebody who's inferior, but because he is paying you a bribe. And that has devastating effects in a number of areas. For example, in roads, we build the best roads in the world outside India. But in India, within India, our roads are terrible. Go to Bangalore and you see the IT capital of now emerging IT capital of the world. The roads are terrible because the politician has to be paid a cut for giving you the contract, and that cut is unbearable. So he puts substandard material, and one rainfall and the whole thing goes. Indian roads are there to see in Iraq, which we built before the Americans came, in Nigeria, in Malaysia, and they are all top-class roads that last for a long time. But in India, no road lasts more than one monsoon. So, therefore, that's because the politicians are discretionary, where he has to make decisions. There are, of course, bigger corruption, defense teams, and so on. Now, what's the cure for that? And I have mathematically shown, by use of the expected value, that even if the probability of catching somebody is small, if you having caught him, if you give him a very harsh punishment, then it is a deterrent factor for others. I can show that the expected value from a bribe is negative. If the expected value of a bribe is negative, then nobody will be rationally corrupt. So therefore, how does one make it that way? And I have shown by my mathematics that it's actually the punishment should be very severe. Now, I think the Americans have got the right idea when they put Skilling in a handcuff or Martha Stewart on a flimsy thing, or Nixon for tapping telephones. Tapping telephones goes on all the time. And in fact, Mao Zedong couldn't understand how Nixon could lose his job because of tapping. In fact, he thought it was a privilege and perquisite of politicians. But anyway, there, if you can do that. Chinese have death penalty for corruption, but then the system is not fair. If you are an enemy of the state, then definitely. Or if some dogs die due to eating dog food in the United States that brings shame to China, then the drug controller in China will be given death punishment. So I mean, it's not a uniformly applied principle, but I think short of death penalty, if you can catch a few politicians who have committed corruption and give them severe punishment, including the appropriation of their properties, then I think corruption is going to attack. In India, no politician yet has served a jail sentence after being convicted. And till that comes, we'll have to live with it.
I had a question regarding the reservation system in India. Do you think it has an impact on Indian development or economic development?
Definitely. All reservations are anti-merit, and therefore it has a negative effect. But I would say any section of Indian society, if it has imposed disabilities, not acquired disabilities, but imposed disabilities, then it is entitled for a period of time for reservations. And I would say scheduled castes and scheduled tribes of the Hindu community and are entitled to reservations. On that I'm absolutely no doubt. But today the government is saying that Muslims and Christians are also, particularly those Christians who have been converted from the so-called untouchable, ex-untouchable class into Christianity, they should be given reservations. I have thoroughly opposed that, because neither the Muslim community nor the Christian community has any imposed disabilities. On the contrary, the Muslims and the Christians ruled India for 1,000 years together, sequentially. And having ruled for 1,000 years, nobody can now say that they have imposed disabilities. And therefore, I would thoroughly oppose any reservation which is for non-imposed disabilities. Therefore, poverty, it cannot be an argument for reservation because the Brahmin community, which is socially the most prestigious, is also one of the poorest in the country. So what we need to do is to see that people get education, access to education. And many of the youngsters whom I taught at IIT would say that we don't want reservations, but we come from municipal school where there's no teacher and there's no blackboard, there's no, even the roof leaks. And then you ask us to compete with the private school, people who come out of private schools in the IIT exam. Well, there's an unfair competition. We just can't make the competition, so we need reservations. So therefore, our primary and secondary education needs to be given a great deal of emphasis. And I think Canada can play an extremely important role in this, in ensuring that our primary education system becomes part of it.
I usually don't like standing behind these because they're almost talking to me. Well, I have the very enjoyable task of offering our thanks on behalf of the School of Business and Economics and Laurier to Dr. Swamy. As a School of Business and Economics and as part of a larger community of scholars and students and business enterprises and leaders, I think we're all keenly aware that we are about the growing importance of globalization. I think perhaps we're even more keenly aware that we need to become more fluent in globalization, its processes, and its impacts, and the opportunities and challenges that it presents. So I think Dr. Swamy's talk today has offered us an excellent opportunity or a window into the opportunities and challenges that are available in India and China. It's very interesting to me, as an economist, the greatest message that I take from your talk today is that the place to start in becoming more fluent in the opportunities that are out there is to look at the official data and statistics, and then to find that, well, that's not enough. It's not enough to look at that because some of those data and statistics need to be interpreted with great caution. Not only that, we need to know more than just data and statistics. We need to know intimate knowledge about the political system and the culture in order to be able to take part in what's going to come forward with globalization. And I think that is a very valuable message that you've delivered to us today. So on behalf of Laurier and School of Business Economics, thank you.